Hey guys, today I want to talk about the loudness war and why just because a track is very loud doesn't necessarily mean that it has no dynamics whatsoever in it. I think when people think about headroom, if there's headroom in a track, that it's very dynamic. Just because a waveform looks crushed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the music from start to finish is just a stale. Um, doesn't necessarily mean that it's just stale throughout the whole track. You really have to use your ears sometimes to hear what's happening throughout the whole song. I think visually we all get very confused when we look at a waveform and think that just because we look at the visuals and we see high peaks or high transients, we automatically assume that there's absolutely no life in the music whatsoever. You really have to listen to the whole track and see what is actually happening. Arrangement is really key, and contrast as well. If you are aiming for that in your music. So here we have a track called "Mysterious Jungle Waterfall" by Michael Wandmaker. So as you can see, the integrated loudness units full scale is about minus 10.4 LUFS, and the loudness range is 5.7 loudness units. So the loudness range is 5.7 LU, and so from this we can see that it's not too dynamic, but it isn't lifeless either, if that's the correct term for it. It's not boring, but it's not. You don't have a massive contrast necessarily. Depends on the genre of music, what dynamic means to you as well. And you can see the true peak max is 0.2 decibels. Now, just because I ripped this off from YouTube, they might have been into sample peaks, and I'm not sure if buying a track digitally versus ripping it, if there is actually such a massive difference in distortion. But yeah, somehow there's always going to be distortion that will always somehow make its way, and that's quite a natural thing to happen. And you can see the maximum. The maximum was about minus 6.4 LUFS, so it does get significantly louder at some point, but it's very brief, considering the fact that it's minus 10.4 LUFS. And for Spotify, this is a perfect minus 10.4 LUFS in the sweet spot. So it would only get turned down 3.4 LUFS in a normal normalization. If you have that option on, it will be turned down 3.6. Yeah. So take away 3.6 from 10.4, you get minus 14. But if you were to have the loud normalization on, it would be about 0.6 decibels. So barely anything gets lost. In terms of the loudness, if there's something sonically wrong with the song, maybe it was mixed in such a way that you'd be able to hear the kick being different, normalized, as opposed to not having any penalty on having the volume at minus 14 LUFS or minus 11 LUFS, depending on if you have one of those two options turned on. So here we have a track called Snake Eyes by Faint, and you can see it's actually much louder than the Waterfall track by Michael Wandmaker. You can see that Faint song has minus 7 LUFS, so it's commercially loud, and it's a drum and bass track, so this kind of makes sense. But also, the loudest range is almost 21 LU, so for a drum and bass track, that's quite unusual to have it that loud. I mean, to have that dynamic range. But then again, some people might think this is a bit too extreme, and I can agree to a certain extent that this is is quite high, and so if you're, it might not be an issue in headphones and AirPods, but if you were if you're listening on speakers and you want to turn down the loud section, that could maybe be an issue, but it depends. But if you're listening on a normalized setting, the loudest you will hear will depend on your aggregator. Usually, it's minus 14 lufs that you hear the loudest part. Again, the momentary max was minus 4.5 lufs, so it does get quite loud. But you can see it is so dynamic because this song starts off with that guitar introduction, and then it gets loud after a certain point. It just suddenly increases, and that can be quite a useful way of arranging your music. It just starts off quite calmly and it's quite soothing, and then the song gets very, very loud immediately, and that's possibly a good way of waking up your audience. And so here we have a track called Answers by AU5. As you can see, the integrated loudness is minus 8.2 lufs, so it's quite soft for I think this is a new beat, mid-tempo, kind of just a general electronic track. It's not ridiculously loud. It is radio friendly, and by that I mean it's loud enough it can compete well in terms of loudness, because people do like. It is true that people still like loud tracks, but of course the loudness range, it's not too high, but it's not low at all. 7.8 LU. That's quite dynamic still for an electronic track. So artists aren't ignoring the potential for developing a song. It develops quite nicely throughout the whole track. Also, the true peak max is 3.7 decibels, and this is the extended version that I've ripped off, and I don't think the original actually had that much of a true peak value, or maybe it did. There is some distortion in this track, but distortion can be both below and above zero, like technical distortion, like going over zero, and also distortion used, effects used in the track. And people often nag about having distortion in the track, and I think it's quite a natural thing to have, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing. It's not present throughout the whole track. Or in this case, it might be. It's not as big of an issue as some people think. If you had really bad converters, for example, or if your speakers are quite substandard, you might be able to hear that distortion, and it might not sound nice. But I think just because of that, just because a converter sounds awful doesn't necessarily mean we should be mastering or mixing or making music at low levels per se. You often hear how platforms or aggregators like Spotify tell you to master at minus 2 decibels true peak, and I think in some genres, like, people say that doesn't really do anything to sound, like on some genres, and like it does mess with sound a little bit. So I wouldn't recommend doing zero either. In between minus 0.1 and minus 0.5 true peak, that's fine. You're still going to get intersample peaks, but it's not as much. And having that distortion could be another nice way of having some development going on in your track. It's quite nice to have some bite in some musical genres, but then in other genres you might not need distortion or to have it that loud. Here we have a track called Zenny by Billie Eilish. You can see very dynamic again, and it's not too loud, but it isn't too quiet either. So again, I think I saw a video by Ian Shepherd before where he said people thought the track was very loud, and that's because of what's happening in the low end that's causing it to be distorted. I think all four of these artists, composers, or mastering engineers, whoever's in charge of the music sonically, knew exactly what they're doing in all four examples. But I have here people will still complain that a track is very loud, and they often forget about the dynamic range there is. Context is really important, and you have to judge how much. You still have to avoid having it too high and having it too low, I'd say. In most cases, of course, it depends. Again, context is key. And again, just even though the sound has there's a lot of distorted parts in the track, it's very minor. It's 0.6 decibels. This is nothing compared to other tracks that have the true peak well over 3 decibels on a positive side, plus 3 decibels. And here we have another example of a loud track, and it's very dynamic. But if you look at the waveform, if you were to just see this part by itself, it looks like a chorus section. If you were to only see what's happening here, and you never ever considered the build up towards the song, you would automatically think it's crushed, because this section does look crushed, but you have to imagine what the waveform would look like without it being limited to up to 0 decibels full scale. I'm using electronic examples because they're just the most common ones that I keep finding that have a ridiculously stupid amount of dynamics in them. Of course, other genres have a massive amount of dynamics in them as well. We can get into lots of classical music, for example, that has probably, it's unbelievable what you can do nowadays. I remember my older tracks, they were very quiet, and they were barely dynamic, and once I sorted out my dynamics, the loudness fell in place with the dynamics, and I can get it to I can get it to a high volume, and it still sounds okay. It is possible. You just have to think of your arrangement a lot more. Arrangement is key, and you have to think of how loud everything is compared to each other. So how loud are your vocals compared to the piano, to the synths, to the guitars, to the bass, to the violas, violins, cellos, etc., etc. How loud is everything compared to each other? I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on your thoughts about how important maybe LUFS is to you, or True Peaks and dynamic range. If you'd like to see a post about loudness meters, we've got a comparison between levels, Logic's loudness meter and a Ulean loudness meter, which is the one I've been using here in Reaper. If you want to see more posts from us, then please go to ksem.com, where we talk about a variety of different topics, and have a look at the posts that we have made. They're all about different topics that are all related to music in some form. Thank you very much. I hope you have a good day.